Okay, while Danilo puts this together, let me share with you briefly something. Historians argue and believe and hold that the 1960s decade was a pivotal decade in between what we call modern and postmodern world. I fully understand the confusion about postmodernity, which means quite a lot to different people. But I'm going to just stay there without any going deeper into what postmodernity is. When we speak of Christianity and what has been happening since after 1945, after the Second World War, in this so-called present postmodern age, we have to also keep in mind that drastic changes, some historians use the term monumental or tectonic shifts or changes have been taking place since then. We have to keep in mind that the changes are not only in culture at large, but also affecting politics, business, and even what is happening in the church and in Christianity. And so, as a church historian, I was approached approximately 10 years ago by a friend of mine. It all happened around the Thanksgiving dinner table. Somebody, the host, she simply asked me, since you teach church history, what can you tell us about the emerging church? At that point, I knew very little about the emerging church. Like most of the people, I also paid little attention to that, which is somewhat to my embarrassment. But because we are supposed to keep updated all the time on what is going on. But teaching world history, teaching church history, basically all necessary courses for the university, sometimes you postpone, and all you can do is read here and there book reviews and advertisements and what you hear and try to keep up with the times. So I was able to somehow get around it and explain, say whatever I had to say, and then she sent me within 1 week a book to read what she read about the emerging church. And basically it was a book, it was the book titled Faith Undone. Some of you probably heard about it, and it is written by Roger Oakland, who is not a Seventh-day Adventist, and also he is not an emergent. That means he doesn't belong to this, he doesn't identify with this, the emerging church. And of course, now you receive a book as a gift, you better read it, because as soon as you see the person, they'll ask you. So I read the book, and immediately there are three things happen. Number one, I'm reading and I'm recognizing, you say, wow, this guy knows what he's talking about. There are a lot of things here that fit with general history. Second thing is, wait a minute, this guy, there are things that I question immediately. As statements that he's making, conclusions and all of that, and I say, okay, wait a minute. There has to be more. Maybe this question needs to be asked. And that is the third component, because I, as a Seventh-day Adventist, I may ask same questions like non-Adventists, but there are questions that we Adventists ask, the others will never ask, simply because of our background. And so it is this that I began to address. I said, okay, I got interested into the subject of the emerging church, and I said, okay, I have to find out what is this phenomenon. Now, and that is how I started. But I decided, instead of reading the books written by the third party, that means the critics, I'm going to start reading the works of the emergents themselves. I will attend their meetings. I will go to get to know them. And what I mean is kind of going to quote original sources, And I'm going to try to kind of explain it from inside, to be fair. And that is how I started. And what I've discovered is not only in academic terms, not only that I'm sharing with others, what I have discovered is that the whole topic brought me to certain awareness of the issues which are going on in contemporary Christianity. Issues that I did not pay attention to, or I did not take it seriously, or I did not understand the seriousness of what is going on. And there are a lot of things that are going on out there in the world that we Seventh-day Adventists are not fully aware of, which is to our embarrassment. I can bring one, for example. As I began to research this and I started working on it, and the word slowly began to spread across the campus, this may come across as criticism. In a way it is, but it is more just informative, just to let you know the state of, so to speak, the state of where we are as the church. And so I discovered my colleagues and even the theologians from the seminary, and I'm not part of the SDA seminary, I am in the college. And they would ask me, as we ask each other, okay, what do you do? What are you reading lately? And so what is your research and so on? And we do share that among ourselves. And as I began to share, well, I'm working now on the emerging church. And you know what the reaction is? Most of the time, it was, what is that? And as I begin to share, people begin to look and say, wow, what is that? I say, okay. So I discovered also, because as okay, let me just go through the slides. I'm going to skip some slides. I hope it doesn't bother you that you don't have time to read all of that, because I want to come to what is the most interesting for you, because I understand that you as a class focus on the issues of creation and so on. So what I'm going to do is Leonard Sweet, which is well known, Brian McLaren, who is well known among Seventh-day Adventists, and also both of these guys are full-fledged emergents. All of them will tell you and argue that since the 1950s, 1960s, fundamental changes are taking place in Christian world. And so much has been written about the emerging church. If you are interested in the subject, go Google it, type the emerging church or emergent Christianity. You'll have tons of books written by both the emergents and critics and all of that. So I'm simply going to push forward. Now, on June 21, 2001, over a phone conference between approximately 12 individuals of young pastors in their 30s, maybe early 40s. Brian McLaren is an exception. He's in his 60s. He's probably today about 69, 70. Brian McLaren, all they were talking, and they decided, how should we call ourselves as a group? Because as they are trying to, not to organize themselves officially, but to begin to organize as they are propagating what they believe. And they decided to call themselves the Emerging Church. Now, I also found out from Tony Jones, who is one of those individuals, who says in his book that others have already previously labeled or suggested to this group to call themselves the Emerging Church. Well, when I came across that, that tells me, oh, the idea of the Emerging Church existed before. It was not created by the Emergents in 2001, which prompted me now to go and look for who is the first one who came up with that term. And so what I discovered is that back in 1968, there is a publication written by Ronald Wilkins who identifies the Catholic Church and the Christian Church as a whole. that means all Christian denominations, as the emerging church. So the emerging church, you must keep that in mind. The emerging church is not another denomination, like Baptist church, Lutheran church, all that. The emerging church is just a term, a concept, and it never intends to institutionalize itself. And you will see why. Because of the very nature of what they believe. And that publication is those two books that you see at the top. And the next volume is published just in, the next one is updated version. Okay, but that's not as much important for you now. This book reveals, number one, that the idea of the emerging church goes back to the very first interpretation of the purpose, intent, and nature of the Second Vatican Council. Second, the primary meaning of both emerging and emergent is, quote, going through an evolutionary process, rather than the conventional that is assumed by the public, oh, it means it just appeared on the scene. The third, the idea of Christianity and the church as a whole going through an evolutionary process, like supposedly nature and life do, is directly attributed to the work of Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, a well-known paleontologist and also a Jesuit theologian and a mystic. So that should also be kept in mind. Now, this in itself takes me to the Second Vatican Council. Now, I also discovered, I don't know if I mentioned earlier, I also discovered, because now as I encounter, the question is what happened at the Second Vatican Council? Well, I knew something about it from literature, as I addressed it before, in my general teaching, in my teaching career. But now, what I discovered is, as I began to ask around, I needed help from an expert on the Second Vatican Council. And I started asking, and guess what? With the death of Dr. Dederer, whom I called at the time, and he simply said, John, I'm sorry, I cannot help you. I'm retired, I'm out of the picture, and my health is not well. You have to go. And the best one, he recommended a person from the seminary, but even that person from the seminary is not expert, what we call expert in the Second Vatican Council. And so I began to wonder, I say, how is it, even today, we Seventh-day Adventists do not have an expert on the Second Vatican Council? How is that? How could that be? Somehow we missed it. And what I'm also learning is that we Seventh-day Adventists have not paid attention what is happening and what was happening during this pivotal, tectonic, monumental paradigm shift in culture, in worldview, in history, and that started in the 1950s, 1960s. So that led me now to go to the Second Vatican Council. Now, I'm going to skip much of this, and I'm going to just briefly tell you what happened. I have to move to Teilhard de Chardin. That is of interest for you. At the Second Vatican Council, the new Pope in 1959, elected new Pope, John 23rd, he decided to convene a new council. Everybody in the Vatican was surprised by it. Why do we need a council? The church is not facing a crisis. But John 23rd had a vision. He previously got involved and he learned about the so-called New Theology School of Thought. These are Catholic theologians, most of them Catholic, some of them Protestant, who called themselves progressives. And they were way different in their vision and seeing the future of the Catholic Church compared to the traditional, conventional conservatives in the Vatican. Now, Pope Pius XII, prior to John 23rd, Pius XII, in 1950, in one of his encyclicals, condemned this group of of progressive theologians. If you ever heard of, for example, Karl Rahner, Yves Congar, Henry de Lubac, Hans Kung, all of these individuals are part of that progressive school of thought. It is Pius XII who labeled them new theologians who are teaching some new theology in a pejorative term. But that term stuck, and they are now, this group is known in history as New Theology School of Thought. These progressives recognized, and their goal was that the church should make a turn. And John 23rd decided to call a council. He assigned the putting together of the documents for the council to Cardinal Ottaviani, who in the Vatican circle was known as arch-conservative. Ottaviani was put together 10 commissions, each commission on a different topic, and they put together documents which will be now discussed by the council, which is about 2,500 members body from Catholic leaders from all over the world. The council opened in 1962. The documents were in preparation for about 2.5 years in advance. But John also appointed one or two of these academics, experts, who were attending the meetings of these commissions without having right to vote. So experts, academics of progressives, they were present and they knew what was happening, but they would not be able to shape the documents. Now, what is very important is the documents, as they would come to the council, and the council lasted from 1962 to 1963, and 1965. As the documents would come to the council will discuss each document. The experts were allowed to speak at the council. The council people who come from all over the world, they were already reading the literature of these theologians, and the council would send documents back to the commission to rewrite them, and these documents were going back and forth until they were accepted by the council. And so when the council was over, it is the conservatives who lost it, and the progressives kind of won it. The victory was not total, because the struggle for the Catholic heart, the soul of Catholic Church, continued. What is important of this, and this is kind of a new vision, new understanding of Christianity that comes out of the Catholic Church, of the Second Vatican Council, pardon me. That is what is meant by those two books, those authors. 1968, 3 years later, they published this book, and they began to, they basically are explaining what I just gave you, told you just in a few minutes. What is important as far as you're concerned? This new, quote, emergent theology that is beginning to form, and it will take several decades until it comes to our times. The fruit of the Second Vatican Council, scholars are now recognizing, actually began to show around 2000. And that's the reason why the public in general begins to recognize or see, the emerging church, what are we talking about? It took some time. And so as all these ideas permeated into the seminaries all over the countries. Emerging theology or emergent Christianity is a different kind of Christianity. And it has three major trajectories. One is ecumenism. Now you can see why the Emergents do not want to institutionalize. Because they themselves believe in ecumenical unity. And by the way, a footnote here, the Catholic Church, prior to the Second Vatican Council, was not interested in ecumenical unity. The shift took place during the Council. And today, the Catholic Church, Lutherans and Anglicans are the champions in this ecumenical unity. Now, ecumenical unit number one. The second one is because the Second Vatican Council called the people to holiness. This is when the Church allowed the Catholics to read other translations of the Bible, not only the Vulgate. That was accepted as revolutionary change. In a way, it was important change. But the Church also actively began to instruct people how to do this spiritual journey toward holiness. What now begins to happen is pretty much what was happening in the centuries before. Even at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church, in order, besides creating the Jesuit Society, who are actually intellectual athletes of the Church. They were trained people who will respond to the Protestants in an argumentative way. The Catholic Church also employed the mystics. Mystics have a different approach in order to counter Protestant piety and Protestant arguments against the Church. So what is happening is now that the same thing is happening in the 1960s. Now keep in mind that between Trent and Vatican II, there is about 400 years. And an interesting thing is, right here on this point, I would like to point out to you, an interesting thing is that when I attended one of the meetings down in Dallas, Texas, and Richard Rohr, if you ever heard of him, last name Rohr, R-O-H-R. He's a Franciscan priest. He leads the Center for Action and Contemplation down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He is the most popular speaker, always giving presentations to many of these emergent movements, conferences, conventions, and workshops. I attended two of these conferences, workshops, and one in the Dallas. He was telling us, the audience, now keep in mind that everybody in the audience, these are some type of leaders, whether teachers, Sunday school teachers, even teachers in public schools. And so these are people who came there for conference, 4 days lasting, and also workshop. I was there because I was interested to learn who are these people, what they're talking about. And the whole conference/workshop in Dallas was called the Emerging Church. That's why I went there. I attended another one called Emergent Christianity held in Albuquerque, and this is also where I met Richard Rohr. Now, Richard Rohr said this. This is in a conclusive meeting. He says, we Catholics made a mistake in the 16th century. You Protestants, and a lot of people in the audience are Protestants. He says, you Protestants accused us of being the beast, being the apostate, being heretics, teaching apostasy, and all of that. And we responded to you in the same way, argumentatively. And for 400 years, he said, you guys were publishing books, articles, attacking us, shooting arrows at us, and we were doing the same thing. And matter of fact, for 400 years, we are fighting wars with each other, and we would not even set our foot in each other's church, even if they were just across the street. And by the middle of 20th century, we decided, now he's speaking as one of these progressives, and he said, we recognize we made a mistake, and we decided we are not going to deal with you Protestants Dominican way, we are going to deal with you Franciscan way. Do you know anything about Dominicans and Franciscans? Both of those Catholic orders go back to the 14th century, 13th century. Now, both of them take vows of charity and poverty and all of that. Both of them practice mystical practices. They meditate, contemplate, and all of that. Both of them believe in education. Matter of fact, higher education. However, whereas Franciscans emphasize primarily contemplation and meditation, Dominicans emphasize primarily argumentative dialogue and so on. Learn, get educated, and argue academically and prove the other side wrong. Now, did you get the point what he meant? He said, for 400 years we were arguing. We're not going to argue with you anymore. We're going to pray with you. Did you notice that? That when people get together and study the Bible, even if you, group of you, 5, 6 of you get together, you start decide we are going to study the Bible. And you start reading text by text and you take commentaries. Sooner or later, you will get into an argument over a text here and there. It is by nature. Rigorous study brings us into argumentation. It doesn't have to be violent and hateful, but it does. When people pray, they don't argue. And that was kind of a shift when he made that statement. Present Pope did not choose name Francis by accident. So keep that in mind. Now, ecumenical movement, mysticism, the third component, what you guys are interested in, which is very important for emergent Christianity. It's theistic evolutionism. I have learned through my research, our problem or our major adversary today, for us, Seventh-day Adventists, given the raison d'etre why we exist, is not Charles Darwin as much as it is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a French Jesuit, dedicated Catholic, but also a person who loved science and became well-known paleontologist. He spent approximately 20 years in the late 1930s, 1940s in China. He is connected with the discovery of the Beijing men. He published in science and he published in theology. His goal in life was to bring science and Christianity together. Charles Darwin argued materialistic evolution. He argued that evolutionary process is driven by natural selection. But Charles Darwin was challenged even in his own days by his friends and colleagues and his contemporaries. And they asked him, and they challenged him, if you argue that matter is all there is, ever was, and ever will be, where does life and intelligence come from? Matter doesn't have it, and it cannot give it. So it took a whole generation for contemporaries and successive philosophers and some scientists who are trying to save evolutionary theory and yet come up with an answer. Where does life come from? And what happens about 40 years later, a whole generation, or maybe generation and a half later, British philosopher Conway Lloyd Morgan came up with a work. If you want to go to Amazon, type in Emergent Evolution. Lloyd Morgan came up with a systematic, well-developed argument that there is such a thing, not natural revolution, materialistic, but emergent evolution. Basically, he did not admit that, but the way he did it, he actually had to borrow from Eastern religions, from monistic systems. Now, he's not interested in Christianity. So you have materialistic evolution, moves now, we have stepped to emergent evolution. Teilhard de Chardin is contemporary of Lloyd Morgan. Teilhard de Chardin disagreed with Charles Darwin. And he said, evolutionary process is driven by principle of emergence. And Teilhard de Chardin comes up with a very interesting, I'm going to show you this patient for a second here. He comes up with, okay, this is his diagram from his book. As you can see, what he says is evolutionary process leads the entire creation into divergence. So you have different species and different kinds and all of that. You guys are way more sophisticated in talking about. That's the point. However, do you see how there at a certain point, I don't know how do you, oh, okay. Do you see this line here? Do you see now what's happening? Teilhard de Chardin argues that, and just keep this in mind, I'm going to come back to this. Okay, he argued that everything that exists, matter, intelligence, knowledge, truth, spiritual realm, all goes through evolutionary process, a process driven by principle of emergence, and pushed forward through 4 coexistent stages. These stages that I will mention, they are not successive. They are kind of one emerges and then the other one, and they keep following, okay? And they all, at the present, right now, all of them are working. 15 billion years ago, cosmogenesis begins. Approximately 2 billion years ago, life breaks through. It's kind of, there is a process goes on, and there is a break. Factor X moves in, and life appears. Now, approximately, 1 million years ago, new Genesis stage begins, which means life acquires intelligence. And it keeps going. And the 4th stage is Christogenesis, which means, and this is, okay, when that convergence now begins to take place with the incarnation of cosmic Christ. Now, the incarnation is not exactly the same what you and I think about 2,000 years ago when Jesus was born from his mother Mary. We are not talking about that. He simply comes up, he's not precise whether it is 10, 15, 20,000 years ago, but the incarnation of cosmic Christ. That's important. And it is way more important where the creation goes. That's Teilhard's argument. It's not, creation should not be defined so much by how it originated, it is how it will end. And from this point on, the task of Christ is to take the entire creation toward the omega point, where in creation becomes one with omega. presumably omega is Christ, divine God. So you can see here very much pantheistic, monistic, Brahmanist understanding. Now, this is graphic presentation of how he understood. Now, this is not true to scale, because I'm dealing here with billions of years, and in order to make it visible for you, what you have here is this shape is supposed to show you this divergence, and then you have convergence. So we live today in this period of time. Now, if you understand, you get this, often you will see, and don't be surprised, that present emphasis in Christianity is Catholics, Protestants, all emergents, is emphasis on social activism. There's nothing wrong with being socially active, but the primary emphasis is on social activism. Why? Because the belief is that we live in an age of the Spirit. We live in the kingdom of God here and now. Now, for you and me to speak of the second coming, it makes no sense for Teilhardian worldview. You bring any... Okay. If you bring into the picture any kind of... Let me see, I want to show you. Just give me in order to save time here. Okay, here. I have another picture. Now, at the bottom here, this is Teilhardian, except that the divergence is not shown here. We live in the kingdom of God here and now, age of the Spirit, Christogenesis, Omega. This here above the blue line, this is pretty much according to the scale. This is Seventh-day Adventist scheme. Now, you can substitute this Adventist scheme with, let's say, Scofield's scheme, or scheme about the rapture, or Pentecostals, or Protestants, or preterist view, or futurist view. You remember all those arguments? We were studying all of that? Different schemes, and we are trying to argue this is the correct, the others are false. Teilhardian worldview eliminates all of these schemes. And this is what is now being accepted. Today, it is pretty much, you go out there and talk, it's pretty much ridiculous to talk about these different schemes. This particular theistic evolutionary system that Teilhard has created is so close to and acceptable to many Christians because it eliminates argumentation and points to the world today. And it calls the public to engage in it. Let's do it. We can do it. Science has helped us to come this far. Matter of fact, and I should stop here, give you some time for Q&A here. Matter of fact, there are groups already who are building upon this, and they are arguing that science and the evolutionary process has brought us to a point where we humans, with technology and knowledge and artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, all of that, we are able to reach next stage, which they call transhuman change. We can become more than human. We can extend our life to maybe 1,000 years. Now, they are not a large group, but they are there. Just go Google transhumanism. You're going to get it, a lot of it. Do you see where it's going? Now, I'm going to stop here, kind of let you ask questions. I don't know how much you follow the quarterly. And I, by accident, I decided, as I was coming here, I said, okay, I don't know, how much do they follow quarterly? Let me see, what is the quarterly discussing this week? Emergent Christianity, I am convinced more and more, the more deeper I go, emergent Christianity is what we Seventh-day Adventists refer to for a long time, the New Babylon in the Scriptures. If you know the Catholic theology, which argues that the church is the body of Christ, incarnated Christ. And there are Catholic theologians who are arguing, and it took Catholic leadership to recognize Teilhardian contribution. What Teilhard argued or suggested is that the church, Christ is leading the entire creation to Omega. Since the church is the incarnated Christ, the church should lead the entire creation to Omega point. You're talking about the healing of the deadly wound? Everything is beginning to set in place.